A woman is offered a job that seems too good to be true, a job that will save her from a life of desperation. But she soon discovers that the beautiful house is a prison, the perfect husband is a monster, and the only way out is to become a monster herself. This story is a descent into the meticulously crafted hell of a perfect family, where every polished surface hides a deep, dark stain. Welcome to The Housemaid, a story about the terrifying secrets hidden behind the perfect facade of the Winchester family. To understand it all, we have to start from the beginning. We have to start with Millie. Millie Calloway's world had shrunk to the size of a 10-year-old Nissan, a metal box on wheels, stinking up a manicured street in the swanky Long Island neighborhood. Her home, her prison, her everything. For a month, she had lived inside its cramped confines, sleeping in a permanent C-shape in the back seat, her legs never quite able to straighten out, a simple luxury she now fantasized about with an almost painful longing. She missed a toilet, she missed a sink, she missed a bed. God, she missed a bed. Her days were a monotonous cycle of cheap sandwiches, ham and American cheese with a dollop of mayonnaise on 99-cent white bread, eaten in the same back seat she slept in. The cooler in the trunk was her pantry, filled with sweating cold cuts and bags of chips. This was her fresh start. This was her life after a decade in prison. A life of desperation, where every rejection felt like another bar slamming shut, where every potential employer looked at her and saw not a person, but a record. It was a life of quiet humiliation and constant, gnawing fear. Every night, she'd drive to a 24-hour rest stop, clutching her keys like a weapon, to use the public showers that smelled faintly of human waste and disinfectant. Every morning, she'd wake up with a stiff neck and the deep, aching loneliness of a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that didn't want her. She lived in perpetual dread of a police officer's knock on her window, a tap, tap, tap that would shatter her fragile existence and send her right back to the one place she swore she'd never see again. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the slow erosion of her spirit, the feeling of being invisible and disposable. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that didn't want her. So when Nina Winchester's online ad appeared, offering a live-in position with a salary that would make a cartoon character's eyes bulge into dollar signs, it felt less like a job opportunity and more like a miracle, a dangerous, glittering, too good to be true miracle. The interview was a study in contrasts. Nina Winchester, perched on a burnt caramel Italian leather sofa that probably cost more than Millie's entire life savings, was the picture of curated wealth. Her cream blouse was made of a material so fine it seemed to float, her silky white skirt hinting at knees that had never known the scrape of pavement. Her golden blonde hair, cut into a fashionable bob, was a perfect helmet of chic that cleverly de-emphasized a slight double chin. She was ordinary, made extraordinary by money, and Millie felt a grudging respect for the sheer effort of it all. Millie, on the other hand, had gone in the exact opposite direction. Her own appearance was a carefully constructed fortress of unattractiveness. A long, chunky wool skirt from a thrift store, smelling faintly of mothballs, a polyester white blouse with puffy sleeves that screamed out of date. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled back into a bun so severe it tugged at her scalp. And the final touch, a pair of oversized, unnecessary tortoiseshell glasses perched on her nose. The effect was professional, non-threatening, and utterly sexless. It was a camouflage she had perfected, a way to make herself invisible to the insecurities of wealthy women. "Tell me about yourself, Millie," Nina began, her voice as smooth as the silk of her skirt. Millie chose her words with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. "Well, I grew up in Brooklyn. I've had a lot of jobs doing housework for people, as you can see from my resume." The resume was a masterpiece of fiction, carefully doctored to erase a 10-year gap. "And I love children, and also pets?" She glanced around the opulent, sterile room for any sign of animal life. A chew toy, a litter box, nothing. But who didn't love an animal lover? Mina beamed. "Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn too. We're practically neighbors." We are not neighbors, Millie thought, biting back a cynical laugh. Mina's Brooklyn was a world of coveted townhouses and artisanal cheese shops. Millie's was a different universe entirely. But she just smiled and nodded. We are. The conversation was a delicate dance. Mina droned on about car seat regulations from the Academy of Pediatrics, while Millie's eyes catalogued the room. The largest flat-screen television she had ever seen, the working fireplace with a mantel littered with photos of the Winchesters in exotic locales, the sparkling chandelier hanging from a ceiling so high it felt like a cathedral. Nina mentioned the salary, a number so large Millie had to swallow hard to keep from choking. And then came the grand tour. The house was a monument to wealth. A gigantic living room, a newly renovated kitchen, a master bedroom fit for royalty, a guest room that could be in a 5-star Manhattan hotel. And then the home theater. Not just a big TV, but a legitimate movie theater with rows of stadium seating and its own popcorn machine. Millie supplied the appropriate "wow," and Nina shivered with delight as if the sheer magnificence of her own home was a constant source of pleasure. At the end of the second-floor hallway, they came to a final door. It was different from the others, the wood thicker, heavier. "Would this be my room?" Millie asked, a flicker of hope in her chest. "Sort of." Mina's hand lingered on the creaking doorknob. She opened it to reveal a dark, narrow staircase. No glamour here, not even a light bulb. At the top was a hallway with the ceiling so low that Millie, who was not tall, felt the need to stoop. Mina gestured to a door on the left. "You have your own bathroom." Then she flung open the last door. "And this would be your room." The room was tiny. The ceiling slanted with the roof so low on the far side it only came up to Millie's waist. A small single cot, a half-height bookcase, a small dresser, 2 naked bulbs suspended from the ceiling. It was modest, even crappy, but to Millie, it was a palace. An actual bed where she could straighten her legs, her own bathroom. The tiny cot looked so good she could have cried. But something was wrong. A little ball of dread was forming in the pit of her stomach. The air was unbearably hot and stuffy, thick with the smell of stale, unmoving air. She couldn't put her finger on it. She walked over to the single window, barely larger than her hand. It overlooked the backyard. Down below, a landscaper was hacking at a hedge with oversized clippers. If I were in trouble, Millie thought, a cold whisper in her mind, nobody would be able to see me back here. I could scream and yell all I wanted, and nobody would hear. The thought was so sudden, so specific, it unnerved her. "It's perfect," she said, pushing the feeling down. As they descended the dark staircase, a voice drifted from the hallway. "Mommy?" A little girl stood there. She had Mina's pale blue eyes, but even paler, and hair so blonde it was almost white. She wore a pale blue dress trimmed in white lace, and she stared at Millie with an unnerving intensity, as if she could see straight through to her soul. She was a creepy Victorian ghost child teleported directly from a horror movie. Millie felt a genuine, ridiculous stab of fear. She was 99% certain this 9-year-old girl would murder her in her sleep. "This is Millie," Mina said, introducing her daughter, Cecilia. The girl's eyes were like 2 little pools of the ocean. "It's nice to meet you, Millie," she said, her voice polite, but her gaze never wavered. Millie still wanted the job. 25% chance of being murdered by a creepy doll child? She'd take those odds. Downstairs, Nina squeezed Millie's rough palm in her baby-smooth one. "I have a good feeling about this, Millie. I really do." Millie wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that this was her fresh start. But she knew Nina was no dummy. A simple background check was all it would take. And once she ran it, the dream would be over. As Millie trudged back to her car, she saw the landscaper again. He was a big guy, muscles straining against his t-shirt, tattoos peeking out on his upper arms. He adjusted his baseball cap, and his dark, dark eyes met hers across the lawn. She raised a hand in a small, hopeful greeting. He just stared. His gaze was so intense it sent a chill down her spine. And then, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. A tiny, silent gesture. A warning. The deception began the moment Millie walked through the door for her first official day. This first part of the story, you see, is a masterclass in misdirection. It is designed with chilling precision to make you, the listener, just like Millie, completely misread the situation. It's built to make you trust the handsome, charming husband and despise the unstable, jealous wife. It's a trap laid with kindness and cruelty, and we all walk into it, blind to the truth that lies coiled and waiting in the shadows. A week after the interview, after Millie had given up all hope and been rejected by a greasy fast food joint called Munch Burgers, Nina Winchester called and offered her the job. Millie was so stunned she was momentarily speechless. Is it possible she didn't check my references? Didn't do a simple background check? The thought was a dangerous spark of hope. She accepted immediately, her heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and elation. She told Nina she could start tomorrow. She was a fast packer, she said, not mentioning that everything she owned was already in the trunk of her car. When she arrived the next morning, the immaculate house from the interview had vanished. In its place was a pigsty. The coffee table was littered with sticky cups and a dented pizza box fused to the wood. Garbage and clothing were strewn everywhere. The dining table still held the remains of last night's dinner. As you can see, Mina said with a cheerful wave, you haven't arrived a moment too soon. So this was Nina's secret. She was a slob. It would take days to clean, but Millie didn't mind. She liked that Nina needed her. If she could make herself invaluable, she'd be harder to fire when the truth eventually came out. Then, Andrew Winchester came down the stairs. He was, Millie had to admit, incredibly handsome. Piercing brown eyes, a full head of mahogany hair, and a sexy little cleft in his chin. He was also several levels more attractive than his wife, which struck her as strange for a man whose net worth had 8 figures. He could have any woman he wanted, yet he'd chosen Nina. Millie respected him for it. Welcome, Millie, he said, his smile warm and genuine as he shook her hand. We could certainly use the help. As he spoke, something flickered over Nina's face. Her lips twitched, her eyes narrowed. It was a fleeting expression, but unmistakable. Jealousy. When Andrew blew Nina a kiss from the front door, it only solidified the image in Millie's mind. A man who deeply loved his difficult, high-strung wife. Up in the attic room, the sense of dread returned. As Nina started to leave, Millie finally noticed what had been bothering her from the moment she first saw it. Nina, she asked, her voice tight. Why is the lock to this bedroom on the outside rather than the inside? Nina's explanation was smooth, too smooth. Oh, we used to use this room as a closet, so obviously we wanted it to lock from the outside. I guess we never switched the lock. It was a plausible lie, but it didn't sit right. As Millie closed the door, her fingers brushed against long, thin lines running down the wood. Scratches. As if someone had been clawing at the door, trying to get out. The thought sent a jolt of ice through her veins. A locked door, scratches. The memories of prison, of the sound of a cell door slamming shut, of the desperation of being caged, flooded back. This room could be a death trap, the voice in her head whispered again, louder this time. She pictured it. The heavy door locked, the window painted shut, the stuffy air growing hotter and hotter until she couldn't breathe. Was she just being paranoid, her mind warped by a decade behind bars? Or was her instinct, honed by years of survival, screaming a warning she couldn't afford to ignore? The landscaper, Enzo, helped her with her bags that first day. As he carried the heavy duffels, he pointed to his chest. "I am Enzo." He was handsome in a rugged, terrifying sort of way. As the front door began to unlock, he looked at Millie with an urgent expression. "You," he hissed, struggling for the English words. He gave up and whispered a single word in Italian, just as Nina appeared. "Pericolo." Later, alone in her stuffy attic room with the window that wouldn't open, Millie typed the word into the browser of her brand-new, Winchester-provided iPhone. The translation appeared on the screen, stark and chilling. Danger. The days that followed were a series of bizarre, manipulative games orchestrated by Nina, each one designed to cement Millie's perception of her as unhinged. First, the peanut butter incident. Millie made Cecilia a snack of peanut butter and banana on crackers. The girl's eyes went wide. "I'm allergic to peanut butter. It could kill me. Are you trying to kill me?" she shrieked. Nina came racing down the stairs, accusing Millie of ignoring a warning she had never given. "I told you about her allergies, Millie. This is unacceptable." But then, when Millie offered to throw out the jar of peanut butter from the pantry, Mina stopped her. "No, better not. We might meet it." The contradiction was maddening, painting Nina as an erratic liar. Andrew later confirmed Cecilia wasn't allergic at all. Then came the lost notes meltdown. Millie came downstairs one morning to find Nina systematically destroying the kitchen, hurling food from the refrigerator, smashing plates on the floor. "My notes," she cried. "I left all my notes for the PTA meeting on the counter. What did you do with them?" Later, after Nina had stormed off, Andrew confided in Millie, shaking his head with a weary sigh. "Nina is high-strung. She has a good heart, but she has done things like this before." He even started to help Millie clean up the mess, positioning himself as her ally, a fellow long-sufferer of Nina's moods. The family feud confrontation was next. Late one night, unable to sleep, Millie crept downstairs to watch television. Andrew found her there, and they bonded over an episode of Family Feud, laughing together on the sofa. He was in his boxers and an undershirt. She was in gym shorts and a tank top. The atmosphere was innocent, comfortable, until Nina appeared at the foot of the stairs, her face a mask of fury. "You think I'm scared that my husband would risk everything in his life for some trampy servant living in the attic?" she seethed, before ordering Millie to stay in her room after bedtime. A few days later, Millie and Andrew went to see a Broadway show, Showdown, a moment of shared escape that felt both thrilling and dangerous. The next morning, Millie found the playbill from the show placed deliberately on her nightstand in the attic. Her blood ran cold. Nina had gone through her purse. She knew. That night, Nina confronted her, a stack of dresses she'd previously given Millie on the sofa. "What is my clothing doing in your room? You stole my clothing. You're a thief." The accusation wasn't just about the clothes. It was about the playbill, about the shared laughter, about the late-night television. It was about everything. Andrew once again stepped in to save her. "Mina, Millie didn't steal this clothing. I remember you emptying your closet. You haven't been able to fit into this in years." His defense was the final straw. He turned to his wife, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I don't think I'm in love with you anymore, Nina. I think we should separate." He looked at her, his expression cold. "I'd like you to leave. Pack a bag and get out." Nina left, defeated and sobbing. Later that night, in the quiet, rain-soaked house, Andrew came to Millie. He took her in his arms, his touch gentle, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something more. They ended up in the guest bedroom. It felt like the culmination of everything they had shared, a moment where the victim and the savior finally found solace in each other's arms. Millie thought she had finally found freedom, a new life with a man who understood her. She thought the monster was gone. But the real monster had just invited her into his bed. And if you think this is a simple story about a jealous wife and a long-suffering husband, you're about to find out how deep the deception runs. Because now we must turn back the clock and see the world through Nina's eyes. Her story didn't begin with malice, it began with hope. She was a young, single mother working a dead-end receptionist job, trying to provide for her baby, Cecilia. Her life was a constant struggle, a tightrope walk over a chasm of unpaid bills and exhaustion. Then she met Andrew Winchester. He was the CEO, her boss's boss's boss, a figure as remote and untouchable as a movie star. But he saw her. He was charming, handsome, and impossibly kind. He took her out for hot dogs on their first lunch date and asked about her daughter. Their romance was a whirlwind, a fairy tale come true. He wanted a family, a wife, and he was willing to take on both her and Cecilia. He was perfect. Too perfect. The first time he locked her in the attic, the fairy tale shattered. Her transgression? Her hair roots were showing, just a few millimeters of darker hair at her scalp. He led her up the dark, creaky stairs to what he called the storage area, a tiny, claustrophobic room with a single cot and the window that had been painted shut. Then he left, and she heard the lock click. He left her there for 2 days, with no food and only 3 tiny bottles of water. When he finally returned, he explained her punishment. "Because you couldn't take care of your hair," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Now you will give it to me." He demanded 100 strands of her hair, pulled from her scalp, the root intact. She sat on the floor of that suffocating room and plucked them out, one by one, until she had fulfilled his grotesque demand. That was the day she realized her beautiful house was a prison, and her perfect husband was a monster. The room was soundproofed. He had a hidden camera. He was always watching. The most horrific event came later. It was the act that would brand her as crazy to the world and give him ultimate control. One afternoon, he drugged her. He drugged baby Cecilia. As Nina drifted in and out of a chemical fog, she saw him place their daughter in the bathtub and turn on the water. The tub began to fill. He forced a handful of pills down Nina's throat. Then he called the police. He told them his wife was having a breakdown, that she was trying to kill their daughter and herself. When the police arrived, they found a drugged, incoherent Mina crawling towards the tub where her baby was moments from drowning. They saved them. Andy was the hero. Nina was the monster. She was committed to Clearview Psychiatric Hospital, her story of a sadistic husband dismissed as the delusions of a sick mind. From the sterile white walls of that hospital, a plan began to form. Mina realized she could never just leave him. He would always find her. He would always use Cecilia against her. He would always have the power because the world had already decided she was crazy. The only way to escape was to find a replacement, a woman Andrew would become obsessed with, a woman he would choose to torture instead of her. Her plan was meticulous, born of desperation and a cold, burning rage. Every move was a performance, and every performance took its psychological toll. To hurl milk across a kitchen she knew she'd have to clean, to smash plates she'd picked out herself, was an act of self-destruction that ate at her soul. But the worst part was the grim determination behind her efforts to push Millie and Andrew together. I had to entice him, she thought, the words a sour taste in her mouth. Every time she saw him smile at Millie, a part of her felt a genuine pang of jealousy, a bitter reminder of the man she thought she had married. But a deeper, colder part of her felt a grim satisfaction. It meant the plan was working. It meant she was one step closer to freedom, even if it meant hating herself for what she was doing. First, she needed the perfect candidate, desperate, beautiful, vulnerable. A woman with a past, someone who wouldn't be missed, someone the world had already judged. Wilhelmina Millie Calloway, fresh out of prison and living in her car, was perfect. Next, she had to make Millie hate her. She became the character Andrew had created for her, the erratic, cruel, unstable wife. She tore up the kitchen, faked meltdowns, and accused Millie of things she never did. Every act of apparent madness was a calculated move to push Millie away from her and into Andrew's waiting arms. She orchestrated their moments together, ensuring they had opportunities to connect, to bond as fellow victims of her craziness. She faked her infertility, blackmailing her fertility doctor with evidence of an affair, all to give Andrew a biological reason to look elsewhere. He wanted a child of his own, and she made sure he believed she could never give him one. And through it all, she had an unlikely ally, Enzo, the landscaper. He too had a past haunted by a monster like Andrew. His own sister, Antonia, had been killed by her abusive husband. He understood. He helped her plan, becoming her eyes and ears, a silent partner in her elaborate, desperate scheme. So when Andrew Winchester, his face a mask of righteous anger, told Nina to leave his house, it wasn't a defeat. It was a victory. The trap was set, and Millie had just walked into it. With Nina gone, the house felt strangely quiet. For Millie, it was the quiet of a new beginning. She didn't know it was the quiet before the storm. She was no longer the maid, but the woman of the house, the one who had saved Andrew from his tyrannical wife. She had no idea that her past, the very thing she had tried so desperately to hide, was about to become her greatest weapon. Because now, with his audience of one gone, Andrew's mask was about to come off. His turn was swift and terrifying. One afternoon he came to her, his expression unreadable. "Millie," he said, his voice flat, "you left some of my books on the coffee table." It was a minor thing, an oversight, but in Andrew's world it was a transgression that required punishment. He led her up to the attic, the same dark, creaky stairs, the same stuffy, claustrophobic room. He closed the door and she heard the sickening click of the lock. The lock on the outside. Her punishment was as bizarre as it was cruel. He made her lie on the floor and balance 3 heavy textbooks on her stomach: a guide to U.S. prisons, the history of torture, a phone book. The weight was crushing, making it hard to breathe. He told her she had to stay that way for 3 hours. "How do you know whether I'm lying or not?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because I can see you," he replied calmly. He showed her the feed on his phone, a crisp, clear image from a hidden camera in the room. This was no impromptu punishment. It was a practiced, sadistic game. He left her there, a prisoner in the room she once thought of as a sanctuary. As she lay on the floor, the weight of the books pressing into her gaze fell upon the small closet. She remembered the blue bucket she had seen in the corner. Dragging herself across the floor, she reached inside. Her fingers closed around a can of pepper spray. Nina. Nina had left it for her. It was a weapon, a key, a promise. When Andrew returned, expecting a broken, compliant victim, he found something else entirely. As he entered the room, Millie lunged. She sprayed the pepper spray directly into his eyes. He screamed, clawing at his face, momentarily blinded. In that instant, the power shifted. She scrambled out of the room, slammed the thick door shut, and turned the key in the lock. The sound of it clicking into place was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. The hunter was now the caged. Millie's torture of Andrew was a twisted reflection of his own cruelty, but amplified, escalated by a decade of pent-up rage. She became the architect of his suffering, watching him on his own phone as she mirrored his tactics. For Millie, this wasn't just revenge for what he'd done to her in the past 24 hours. It was a release of a violence that had been dormant inside her for years. The memory of breaking a boy's arm on the playground, of smashing her fist into a coworker's nose, those weren't aberrations. They were glimpses of a capacity for brutality that Andrew had just fully awakened. She wasn't just punishing him for Nina or for herself. She was punishing every man who had ever tried to control her, to hurt her, to make her feel powerless. A cold, righteous anger fueled her, and with every act, she felt less like a victim and more like an instrument of justice. First, the books. "You know what you need to do," she said, her voice cold and steady through the door. She made him lie on the floor, but this time he had to balance the heavy books on his genitals. Andrew's initial arrogance quickly dissolved into whimpers of agony. She watched him on the phone, his face contorted in pain, his pride crumbling with every passing minute. He was no longer the master of the house, but a broken thing on the floor of a hot, stuffy room. Then she denied him food and water. His pleas grew more desperate, his voice hoarse. He begged, he bargained, offering her millions of dollars, a life of luxury, anything she wanted. She refused. She let him wither, his strength fading, his bravado replaced by the raw, animal fear of a creature facing its end. He cried for Nina. He cried for his mother, his psychological collapse as complete as his physical one. The final demand was the most horrific. His voice was a dry rasp when he begged for water. "I'll let you out," she promised, "but you have to do something for me first." She slid a pair of pliers under the door. "If you want to get out of the room, all you have to do is pull out one of your teeth." He howled, slamming his weakened body against the door. She watched on the phone as he fell to his knees, sobbing, a pathetic wreck of a man. Then, with a shaking hand, he picked up the pliers. He brought them to his mouth. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. But he did it. And then she made him do it again, and again, 4 times. He offered her his teeth, bloody and grotesque, in exchange for his freedom, in exchange for water. She never gave it to him. She watched him on his own phone as he died. Slowly, from dehydration. His body finally grew still, his dead eyes staring up at the ceiling of his own prison. In the silent, stuffy attic, the monster was finally dead. But a new one had just been born. And now the only question left was what to do with the body. The final act was not about escape, but about the cleanup. It was about erasing the crime and, in a twisted way, realigning the scales of justice. The aftermath required a new kind of performance, one that would solidify the lie and protect the guilty. A worried Enzo, unable to reach Millie for days, used the spare key he knew Nina kept under a potted plant to enter the house. He found Millie, terrified and shaking, and immediately called Nina. Nina returned to a house of horrors. She found Andrew's desiccated body in the attic, the pliers lying beside him, his face a rictus of his final agony. She confronted Millie, who was on the verge of a complete breakdown, and in that moment, Nina made a choice. She had set this chain of events in motion. She would be the one to end it. "You're going to leave here," Nina told her, her voice firm. "I'll tell the police I was here all week. I'll say I gave you the week off." She would take the blame. With her documented history of psychiatric problems, a story of self-defense, of a struggle that went too far, might be believed. Or, at the very least, it would send her back to a hospital, not to prison. It was a sacrifice, the final move in her long game. She called the police and fabricated her story, preparing to face the consequences. But then came the final, shocking twist. The lead detective on the case was a man named Connors. As he questioned Nina, he revealed a startling personal connection. His daughter, Kathleen, had been Andrew Winchester's ex-fiancée. The one who had broken off the engagement years ago, moved away, and changed her name. The breakup, Connors explained, had destroyed her. She never dated again. He had always wondered what Andrew had done to her. Now, looking at the scene in the attic, at the evidence of prolonged, sadistic torture, he had his answer. He looked at Nina, sitting on her 5-figure Italian leather sofa, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with justice. He accepted her story. The bruising, the missing teeth, it was all consistent with a violent struggle. It was a shame what had happened to Mr. Winchester, he concluded, a terrible cautionary tale about how easy it is to get locked in an attic. He ruled the death an accident. It was a form of vigilante justice, a quiet closing of a very dark chapter. At the wake, Nina stood beside Andrew's open casket, playing the part of the grieving widow. Andrew's mother, Evelyn Winchester, approached her. She was immaculate in black, her expression unreadable. She looked down at her son's body, then turned to Nina, her eyes cold and shrewd. "They told me about his missing teeth," she said, her voice a low murmur. Nina's blood ran cold, but Evelyn wasn't angry. She explained that when Andrew was a child and didn't brush his teeth, she would punish him. "If you don't take care of your teeth," she said, a chillingly calm expression on her face, "then you lose the privilege to have teeth." When I pulled out one of his baby teeth with pliers, I thought he understood. It's such a shame that he never really learned. I'm glad you stepped up and taught him a lesson. In that moment, Nina understood. The cycle of abuse was generational, and Evelyn had just given her tacit, monstrous approval. A year later, Millie Calloway was interviewing for a new housekeeping job. She was confident, calm, the ghost of her past finally laid to rest. Her new potential employer, a woman named Lisa Killifer, was friendly, almost desperate to hire her. As Lisa tugged at the collar of her blouse, Millie saw it. A dark, purple bruise on her upper arm, in the distinct shape of a man's fingers. "Nina Winchester recommended you very highly," Lisa said with a smile. And in that instant, Millie understood everything. Nina hadn't just saved her, she had recruited her. The Winchester house was finally quiet, but for Millie Calloway, the work was just beginning. Because some monsters don't die, they just find a new house. And now, she was the one who answered the ad.